Next up, the time to act is now, doubling down on climate change with Daniel Kreeger, co-founder and executive director of the Association of Climate Change Offices. Thanks for joining us, and one little shout out to our sponsors, the Aspen Times, Michael Fuller Architects, EW Stetson, and Holy Cross Energy. Thank you.
All right, so I'm Dan Kreeger. I'm the executive director of the Association of Climate Change Officers. Out of curiosity, how many experts are there in gravity in the room? None. Okay, anybody in hypnosis? Awesome, so I got you beat on both of them. Not that I'm an expert on either one of them, but I stayed in a Howard Johnson's last night, so we're gonna play with that. Pretend I'm gonna try and hypnotize you for a second, all right? Let's get the creative juices going, okay? Close your eyes. Actually, close your eyes. I'm going to soothe in my voice. And I want you to imagine a world 30 years from now where gravity is either 50% stronger or 50% weaker than it currently is. You get to choose, weaker, stronger. So on January 1, 2047, you're going to open your eyes when I click my fingers, and either gravity is going to be stronger or it's going to be weaker. You get to pick, all right? All right, so 1, 2, 3. My snapping's not as good as it used to be. All right, so I want you to look around. Gravity just changed. It's 50% stronger or 50% weaker. What does that mean for your surroundings? Anyone? Are you sitting under a lantern, under a chandelier? Are you wondering whether or not that fixture is strong enough to hold it because gravity's 50% stronger? Or if you've got a big butt like me, are you wondering whether or not the chair will hold you? Or if you're the opposite of me, are you wondering whether or not you'll float off, right? So our whole world is built on some pretty basic assumptions. That what we think is going to happen, the sun comes up in the morning, gravity is always the same. Our climate systems are predictable within a level of variance that we can accept. And then we manage risk to it. And guess what? The rules of the game just changed completely. So over the next few decades, basically, every rule, every assumption that we made is pretty much wrong. Everything. We don't have gravity officers, do we? Do we have gravity professionals? No, we integrate that into our decision making, right? If you're educated in any way, shape, or form on this planet, you pretty much know that if you take this and you drop it, it's going to fall every time, right? No question about that. Except for apparently a bunch of chief procurement officers from electric utilities who I asked about it, and they said, well, they weren't quite sure whether or not that would be the case. Didn't realize we were still debating gravity, but we are still debating climate, right? Well, what if we started treating this like the world is changing around us and we need to develop a skill set to deal with it? So 2 months before I went to Copenhagen, I wrote a piece that was the founding piece conceptualizing why we needed climate change officers, the establishment of a new occupation that would lead large institutions in developing their enterprise responses for dealing with climate change. I thought I was pretty sharp at the time coming up with that idea. I'd marked out all the different groups within an organization that are affected by it. I even started mapping out where in the organization structure it would be. And it never dawned on me at the time that I was writing this piece that it wasn't just about the person leading the initiative, that every person in that organization was going to need a skill set that they don't have. So let's give a couple of examples. We want to scale up renewables, right? This is our day. All right, so let's take aside the developer, the financier, the technology, and let's talk about the person or the entity who actually has to make a renewable energy business case within their institution. They got to go through their legal department, their procurement department, their finance, their energy management, their facilities management, their risk and continuity. And if they want to do like a 20-year PPA, none of those folks even know what that is. They've never seen it before. So Lockheed Martin, for example, had one of our staff on site for 2 years. They hired this person just to develop a corporate-wide renewable strategy, and it took 2 years to get one deal off the ground. Everybody has to be educated from scratch. These people didn't go to school for this. They haven't been professionally trained or had any continuing education. But they've been to their cybersecurity trainings about 42 times and their workplace harassment trainings about twice that. and rightfully so. But they didn't get anything on this. About Miami Beach, they decided to raise roads on a portion of the island by 2.5 feet. I can think of some very obvious questions that you would ask if you were going to raise roads 2.5 feet, like how's this going to affect insurance coverage, property value? Well, you need to have people whose function is that to assess that. Not just an engineer designing a really cool project for raising roads 2.5 feet in the corresponding stormwater system. Those folks don't have these skills. They don't. So what we've seen already is we've seen credentialing bodies starting to update their language that is aspirational. This is what we think an architect should be. This is what we think a civil engineer should be. I'd argue that every one of these professions is already in violation of their core competencies, their codes of ethics, because they're making recommendations on a daily basis that are in conflict with it. For example, does anybody here think you should be allowed to be an architect in this country if you're not accounting for climate change in your designs? I would argue if you're going to put a building up for 100 years, you should be able to model out what that building is going to experience over that 100 years and not looking backwards. Well, it turns out that that's not the case. I serve as an advisor to the Dean of the College of Architecture at Florida International University in Miami. That school is the 3rd largest school in the country. It's the #2 architecture program in the country. 80% of their students come from South Florida and are staying in South Florida, which means they are designing buildings for sea level rise ground zero. And they are not required to understand what sea level rise is. Why? Because there's not an employer in the country who says, if you want this job, you have to have these skills. They're a supplier. And the demand signal hasn't come. So here's our challenge. Any sort of change curve, you hit your chasm. And we're at our chasm. We've got our innovators, we've got our early adopters, and we've hit this wall. Right? You guys are all in the innovation and early adoption phase. How do we go from here to this becomes the norm? And at some point, you can start looking at other developments in completely different walks of life, or maybe not in completely different. How about green building? Was there such a thing as green building 30 years ago? Better yet, did most office job descriptions require you to have any sort of competency on computers 30 years ago? How many of you are sitting with laptops or smartphones on? Could you get your job without knowing how to use a computer? No. We've evolved. We can do this. But what happened in the green building space is we got legislation that mandated a certain number, a certain percentage, a certain portfolio, a certain caliber of efficiency in our buildings. And that created a marketplace that demanded people with those skills. There's an occupation of green building, and then there's the integration of green building competencies into numerous other professions. So if you look at USGBC's core communities, it includes architects, facilities managers, energy managers, real estate developers, so on and so forth. It's not one occupation. It's green building competencies into numerous occupations. So how do we get across this chasm? We establish a strong demand signal. So one of the things that we've been looking at, and I'm going to talk to you in a minute about what we're doing here in Colorado, is looking for leadership to not say 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees or 80% or 50%. Because I'll give you all of that, and I'll double down and tell you, you don't have the workforce to do it anyway. You know, we haven't been trained and educated to do this stuff. And if we're going to functionally redesign how our communities are built, how our businesses function on a day-to-day basis, we're going to need a workforce with a completely different skill set than it currently has. So we have to measure out, here's today's workforce, here's tomorrow's, and what is the delta in between? How do we get there? Executive mandates and legislation. We've done this in other walks of life. I helped launch an organization in 2001 that became the standard bearer for anti-money laundering specialists. Yeah, that was a fun one. But guess how that started? After 9/11, Congress said, we're going to go chase the bin Laden money trail, and every financial institution in the country now needs to have this capability. And what did it do overnight? It created a workforce of 11,000 money laundering experts. If you've ever seen the movie Catch Me If You Can, you'll know that prior to 9/11, we had about 10 in the country. That's how you scale it up. But we're not looking at it this right way. So we've done this before. We've done this with computers. We've done this with green building. We've done this with ethics and compliance. We've done it with cybersecurity. And in each one of those instances, we did it in a different way. Cybersecurity hasn't been mandated by legislation, although there are in public domains requirements. but green building was. Right? So we can do it in both sides. We can do this in the executive side of the house. We need CEOs, mayors, university presidents to say, hey, starting January 1, 2020, 2022, you want to work for me in these occupations, you need to have that climate delta of competencies. You don't have those skills by that time, you're not eligible to have this job. You're applying for the job, it's in the job description now. Don't have those skills, can't demonstrate them, sorry, can't work here. We'll even provide you the continuing education because it turns out that most large arts institutions already do that through their HR shops. Now, the previous administration actually wrote a mandate for climate preparedness training into Executive Order 13693. In fact, the subsequent federal environmental executive to the predecessor, who's in the room, John Powers, right now, wrote that in along with a mandate that it needed to be all senior executive service and GS-15 employees of the federal government. I actually lobbied her to make it GS-13 and up. That was 10% of the management. That was 10% of the entire federal workforce. That's your decision making. And I'll give you an example of what happens when you don't have the right decision making. I used to work in the Pentagon, in the Department of Defense. Every year at the end of the fiscal year, somebody would come to me and say, hey, we've got $3 million, $4 million, we've got to spend it, we've got to protect this budget for next year. Go print something, go warehouse it, go ship it. We need to spend this money. Well, guess what? That was a bad climate change decision. Why? Because it doesn't matter how green the vendors we use at that point were. We were printing stuff that didn't need to be printed, we were warehousing stuff that didn't need to be warehoused, and we were shipping stuff that didn't need to be shipped. We were just spending money and burning emissions on the way there. That person doesn't need to be a climate change officer, but every day they're making a decision that is directly relevant, and it's not just climate change, it's our broader environmental sustainability attributes. Oh, by the way, were we to actually activate, and I'm sorry this is small, but there's a paper on the ACO website, acoonline.org, where you can see this in greater detail. Roughly speaking, there's about 1 million professionals that are in credentialed occupations that directly intersect with climate change issues on a day-to-day basis and don't know it. Or maybe they do know it and they don't have the skills to deal with it. Imagine what a workforce could look like if a city was tackling this not with 2 people, but with dozens or hundreds. Or a company, instead of having 4 people in their sustainability shop, had this skill set built in, and a skill set that differed from one occupation to the next, because your supply chain and procurement person doesn't need to know the same things as your civil engineer, right? But we can do this with that demand signal. So what we're looking at is taking our ordinary versions of us and turning them into superhero versions of us. Except we don't have to be superheroes. We have to learn to live and make decisions in the world that we've created for ourselves, which is a vastly different world than one that we've been living in for the last few decades. So that's going to take me forward to an exciting thing that's happening here in Colorado. So Steve Skadron, the mayor of Aspen, for those of you who don't know him, came back from Paris last year and said, well, why do I need to go to Paris to collaborate with my peers? It kind of seems silly. Let's build something like that here in Colorado. Somehow I got thrust into the middle of it, and I said, well, instead of saying let's do Paris or let's do 2 degrees, let's actually build a workforce that's capable of doing this. How about we get our mayors of cities and counties here in Colorado to mandate climate change training for their senior staff? And then within 2 years, they have to establish a new goal. And then this compact serves as a technical support resource for providing solutions, potentially securing funding for the local implementation. This, to my knowledge, is the first compact that focuses extensively on actually building the skills from the elected official and enhancing public awareness and public will to the city manager to be able to account for this across the city's operations, to civil engineers, to transportation planners, to energy managers, all covered under this. If we can get this replicated, and Minnesota and Maryland have already expressed interest in doing such, you start onboarding thousands of professionals who actually have the skills to ask the question, how does climate change affect my decision making on a day-to-day basis, and what do I need to do to respond to it? Does that mean that every single person needs to be a climate change expert? No. But they need to know enough to start doing the sniff test on things that come before them, right? So this is the first signal This will stand up in the fall. In fact, we just finished drafting the charter that will go out to the 32 signatories. We actually even had the mayor of Jackson, Wyoming, and several Utah communities ask if they could participate in this compact so that they wouldn't have to create their own. But we can do this. And what we're looking for now is, what kind of leaders can we get to come out and say, okay, if you want to work for me starting January 1, 2020, and you're an architect, you're a civil engineer, you're an energy manager, you're a facilities manager, you're a supply chain or procurement professional, you're in legal, you're in finance, you need to understand how these issues intersect with your profession and go out and get the training. We'll even provide it. And I'm out right at 15 minutes. So am I getting A or am I getting A? All right. Thank you for indulging me.